Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Julia McLeod, and I'm the Outreach Director for Harpswell Heritage Land Trust. As a small community land trust, we focus on land conservation, stewardship, and trails, and also community outreach and education. So I'm really glad that you're able to join us for Intro to Birding tonight. I'm really grateful to Judy Marino for sharing her knowledge and expertise in this area, being willing to teach us all even through Zoom. So I appreciate that. Thank you for doing that. Just a couple of things about the Zoom webinar. We are recording this, but that does not mean that we can see you out there in the audience. I can't see any of your faces, but there will be a recording if you want to share it with others. Judy has also created a handout to go with this, and I'll be emailing that to everyone right after the webinar is over. So without further ado, I'm just going to pass it over to Judy.
Can we see this now? Intro to birding?
I can see it just fine.
Okay, great. And welcome to everybody out there. This is a great time of year, May. The warblers and other songbirds are coming through, so I'm glad and very happy that you could join us here. This is called Intro to Birding, and I almost called this Intro to Birding because even intro classes tend to run 2 or sometimes even 3 sessions. So this is really a really basic intro, but I hope that I can give you enough tools and ideas so that you can move forward on with your own interest after this is over. We're going to start with looking at some basic identification clues to a bit. I also want to kind of emphasize it's not that important that you are able to identify every bird that you see. You get out in the field and just enjoy being out there, looking around. A lot of birding is just kind of highlighting your observation skills and therefore your enjoyment of being in whatever environment you're in. It does add to your enjoyment as you become more experienced and you're able to identify the birds and the trees and the flowers, but don't get too upset with yourself if you're not able to identify right away. But we are going to start with some clues to give you a start. And then also we're going to move on and see how the habitat is going to influence what birds you see. And then we'll take a look at equipment. And I think we moved along a little fast there, but anyway, we're going to take a look at equipment. And luckily there's not a whole lot of equipment that you need, but you probably will need a pair of binoculars, and we'll go over just a little bit on what to look for, because there are some binoculars that are great binoculars, but they're not particularly good for birding, and we'll go over that. And then finally, and maybe the most important thing, is to go over some tools and some resources that you can use on your own after this session is over. This is the first slide, and you might think it's kind of a weird slide. I mean, like, you're looking at this and you might be thinking, well, gee, I'm taking this intro session and I can tell that there's a heron in the middle column, and I can see that that's a hawk. So, you know, why is she showing me this? This isn't telling me anything I don't already know. Well, that's actually why I'm showing it to you, because it illustrates that you already have the basic approach to identifying birds. You can tell what these birds are without any additional information, partly because you know that a heron in the center is much skinnier than and much bigger than the robin that's next to it in the upper left-hand corner. And so just like you can recognize a friend who is very tall as he walks down the street. You can and compare that to another friend who is short and maybe heavier. The same thing with birds. So as you're out in the field, you'll start getting used to the shape of different birds and also other identifiers. So no matter what course you take in Intro to Birding, they almost always will start with this particular approach. And we'll be going over some apps at the end of this. And one of the apps that is created to help people identify, called Merlin, and some of you might have already heard of it. The first thing they ask you is, well, what is the shape and the size, particularly what is the size of the bird you're looking at? And so you want to choose a bird that you can use as a benchmark, a bird that you can compare in your own head as to whether you're seeing something bigger or whether you're seeing something smaller. And a lot of people choose a robin as that benchmark because it gives you an opportunity to say, oh, the bird I saw is bigger than a robin, or perhaps the bird you see will be smaller. Now in May, for instance, when you're looking at some warblers, which is a type of songbird, most of the warblers, in fact, I think all the warblers are going to be smaller than a robin. However, there are other songbirds that will be bigger. And the thing I will ask you then, if you, next time you're out walking around and you see a robin, is take a moment to really look at it. Try to look at it at different distances. Look at a robin that's up in a tree. What does it look like when it's that far away as compared to maybe just in your own backyard? Excuse me. So try to just start getting used to maybe looking a little more precisely than you have up to this point. Another approach to size, and these are two birds that I think a lot of you probably are already familiar with. They will even come to a feeder if you have some suet out or other food for woodpeckers. And I'm showing you this one, well, for one reason, because they're common. The one on the right is a downy woodpecker, and the one on the left is a hairy woodpecker. They both are in Maine, and the downy woodpecker on the right is more common than the hairy, but they both are pretty common. But looking at them can be really confusing. If you see them out in the field or you see one of them on a tree, it's like, well, gee, if I don't know which one it is because they look awfully similar, and you can't tell which is the bigger one if you only have one out there. So I'm showing you this because there's another way you can use the idea or the concept of size, and that is to compare a part of a bird to another part of the same bird. So that way you have a constant. It doesn't matter whether the bird is far away or close up. You're comparing one part of the bird to this another part of the same bird with the same distance. Now, I don't know, besides the fact that the one is obviously bigger than the other, there's one part of the hairy woodpecker which is a lot bigger than the downy woodpecker, and that is the bill or the beak. You'll notice the downy woodpecker, the beak only goes about a third of the way across the head, the width of the head, whereas with a hairy woodpecker, it goes about 2/3, almost all the way across the part of the head. So if you see one of these birds in a tree and you can't really tell whether it's small or big because you don't have a point of comparison. If you look at the bill, it'll pretty much tell you whether you're looking at a hairy or a downy. And we can use this same approach with some other species, not all of them, of course, but with some. Here's another example. There's a starling on the right-hand side, excuse me, and a grackle on the left-hand side. Now, at first you might say, well, gee, I can tell the difference. But you have to also be aware that sometimes you've got nice clean pictures when I'm showing you a picture, or your field guide has a nice clean picture. But when you're in the field, sometimes it's dark. Sometimes you just don't have the kind of coloring that you have on a nice clean picture. But the one thing that will, again, be obvious, no matter if you have good coloring or not, and that is the size of the tail. So when you see a bird about the same size and it's flying along above you, you really can't see the eye. In the case of the grackle, the eye is yellowish, but you can't see that. It's just flying around. You can see the long tail though. So you just, at a quick glance, you can tell that, oh, those are grackles. And then also they often are with other like grackles. But the main point here is that, again, you can compare one part of the bird with another part of the bird. But probably an even bigger or more important key here, at least when you're trying to decide where to go to look for certain kinds of birds, is to think about, well, what is the bird going to eat? Birds basically are spending most of their time and energy doing one or two things. They're either looking for food, or they're looking for a mate, or of course trying to raise the next generation of that species. So they're going to be looking for habitat that either gives them protection or habitat that gives them food. And so that's going to be your guideline. And when you go out birding, sometimes you're not specifically going out birding, you're just going out for a walk. And so you want to look around and see, oh, well, I'm in the middle of the woods, or I'm near the shore, or I'm on Mitchell Field, and I'm looking out at the open meadow. And so you can say, well, what kind of birds am I likely to see in this kind of a habitat? Or you can go the other way around. You can say, oh, I particularly want to see a particular kind of warbler. So then you go out to one of the preserves that provides that kind of habitat. But the main thing is, if you are looking for warblers, they're going to be where there are insects, because look at that bill in the upper right-hand corner. Look how narrow and pointed it is compared to the bill of finch. So if you're looking for a warbler, you're going to be looking in an area where there are going to be more insects. And on the other hand, one reason you can get finches and more easily in your own, let's say your own feeder, your own backyard, is it's a lot easier to put out seeds for a finch than it is to put out insects for a warbler. So some of you probably have a couple feeders in your backyard, and I suspect that you have a lot more sparrows and finches in your backyard than you do songbirds, just because it's easier for you to put out the appropriate feed. Now, the two birds at the bottom, it's pretty easy to see what they are without going into too much detail. You can spot a raptor, and you can see how that beak is perfect for tearing into the mammal or the other bird, or whatever the food source is. And then I just put the crossbill in the lower right-hand corner as an example, that there are some species that are just, their bills are just highly developed over thousands of years for particular food sources. And this is a crossbill, and they've developed to eat cones, of various evergreen cones, and that bill will get into the inner part of the coat and the seed. So that just one of the things you'll do as you're looking at a bird is look at the bill, and that'll help you to start understanding what you're looking at. And as I said, the finches, this is a house finch, both a male and a female, and they're eating seeds. And that's one reason why they're easier to bring into your backyard. Now, this is a warbler, and this is one of the earlier arriving warblers. This is a yellow rump warbler. If you look at the right above the tail, you'll see that's yellow, and that's the rump, and it's called a yellow rump. And this is an interesting warbler. And the birds I'm going to be showing you throughout this whole presentation are very common birds. I'm not going to show you something that is really, really scarce. This is this is probably the most popular warbler for beginners to find, because it's a little bigger than most warblers. It's also arrives earlier. And one reason it can arrive earlier is because even though it eats seeds, it also, it eats insects, but it also can eat seeds. And so it isn't as dependent, 100% dependent on making sure that the insects are out in plentiful amounts. So it can come up a little earlier and not risk getting here too earlier and not having food sources. And it also will hang around later in the fall for that same reason, because it has a wider food source. The birds that are more limited into the bird sort, into what they can eat, obviously have to be more careful that they don't arrive until they have enough insects or whatever their food source is. This is another insect-eating bird, and this is a flycatcher, and this also is fairly early. It is one of the earlier birds, but it's primarily insect-eating, but it can eat just enough other sources so that it can risk getting up here a little early. And I mentioned, I'll show you the flycatchers because they also are one of the easier birds to see, because they perch. And they, when they do go out to catch an insect on the wing, they usually come back to pretty much the same spot. So if you see a flycatcher, and a phoebe is a type of flycatcher, you can pretty much watch them for quite a while, because they'll fly off of the tree, they'll grab the insect, and then they'll come back, and you can really get a long opportunity to see them. This is another very, very common bird. However, it's not that easy to see, but you will hear it in almost any wooded path that you take in Harpswell. And we're going to come back to this one. This is called an oven bird. And it looks like a thrush, for those of you who know what a thrush looks like, but it actually is a song. It's considered a warbler, and rather than a thrush, but it does spend most of its time either on the ground like a thrush or very close to the ground. And the reason I'm showing it to you, even though they're not that easy to see, they tend to hide, but they have a very loud song. And even though we're not going to get into bird songs that much at all on this presentation, that's another whole major topic, and just can't really get into it in an hour and a half. But I do want to mention as we go along here, which birds do have either a very distinctive song or a very loud song, so that when you get started in some bird songs, and I do recommend that you learn a few. I don't recommend that you sit down and play one song after another from a wide variety of species, because that would just be frustrating. It's hard to learn it that way. But if you learn, say, 3 or 4 or 5 of the most common songs, then when you're out in the field walking, you're more likely to hear 1 or 2 of those songs, and it really enriches your experience. It also will give you some idea as to whether you want to spend more time looking for that particular bird if you're just hearing it and not seeing it, or whether you want to continue, moving along and looking for some other bird rather than the one you just heard. So the ovenbird is one of the birds that I would recommend that you do try to hear their song. And actually, I'm going to play, and this is the only time I'm going to do it on this presentation, but I'm going to play the ovenbird song just because it is very loud and because you're very likely to hear it. So here goes. Okay, it's pretty much the same pitch, but it just gets louder and louder. It starts and then it gets louder and louder along the same pitch. And when you're walking through the woods, that's what you're going to hear. Almost guarantee it. If you're in Curtis Farm Preserve, or if you are going up the Cliff Trail, or any number of the wonderful preserves in Harpswell that have some wooded areas. It has to be a decent size preserve though, because fragmentation is a real problem in conservation because it doesn't protect the bird. If the parcel isn't large enough, then a bird that's particularly one like the ovenbird that's on the ground is susceptible to various predators that can come in through the edge. Okay, let's move along here. Here's another very, very common bird, which you also, I'm not playing any more songs, but this is one that I recommend that you try to listen to on your own, either through one of the apps that I will mention at the end, or one of the websites that I'll mention. This is a song sparrow. They also are pretty easy to see because they also perch. They're not real flighty, and they just sing everywhere, whether it be Mitchell Field, whether it be Curtis Farm, wherever you are, you will probably see and hear a song sparrow. But what we're looking at here is we see that not only do you have the additional markings like you do with the ovenbird, which is one of the identifiers is to look at the breast in addition to the bill, but you also have this spot in the middle of the chest. And the other difference, which I actually should have mentioned right here, was another identifier is the eye. If you notice that this eye on the ovenbird has that white circle around it, whereas this bird doesn't. So you've got 3 areas now just to try to get used to looking at when you look at a bird. First the bill, then in the eye. Is there a circle around the eye? Is the eye colored? And is the breast clear, or is the breast straight? And you can certainly see the difference on various breasts. We're going to look at one more sparrow, and we'll come back to the song sparrow, but you can be able to see the big difference. Here is another sparrow. Very different than the song sparrow, isn't it? The bill is a different color. The eye has a white ring around it. The breast is totally clear. And there's one other area that is different. If you look at this, I don't know if you can focus in on it. I'm asking you to do a lot, I realize, but The 1/4 area that is a key identifier that field guides will suggest that you look at are wing bars. So here, this bird has very distinctive two white lines in the wing area, and they're called wing bars. So if you take the light colored beak, you take the white around the eye, you take the clear breast, and you take the wing bar, and you've got what's called a field sparrow. This is a field sparrow. And there's pretty obvious difference between a field sparrow and a songbird. And I'm going to mention later on a place that it's the only place I'm going to mention that's not on Harpswell, but near Harpswell, where I guarantee you will see field sparrows because they breed there. I'm not saying there aren't places in Harpswell too, but there's one place between here and Bath that it has a very, very different habitat. And so the types of birds there and the number of those species are different than any of the preserves in Harpswell. All right, you might be wondering, well, geez, she hasn't mentioned color at all, and which is kind of weird, because if somebody comes up to you and says, hey, I just saw a bird and I don't know what it is, and you ask them to describe it, usually the first thing that person, who, especially if they're not a birder, will say is, oh, the color. Well, it was red, or it was blue, or whatever color it was. But yet here I am waiting until near the end of the identifiers to even mention color. And the reason is that color can be kind of like a misleading clue. It's helpful, but it isn't always accurate. It's amazing what sunlight or lack of sunlight will do to what you see. I've seen indigo buntings that look black because of the way the light reflects off of the plumage. And also another aspect of color is that the plumage might change color based on the time of year, and also based on in some cases, on the sex. Now, in this case, we're looking at indigo buntings, the male on the left side and the female on the right side. And most people who really don't learn too much about birds, they would probably not ever guess that the bird on the right is also an indigo bunting because it's a female and they're used to thinking it as blue. So I'm not saying don't look at color, but just be aware that it might not be the color that you're used to associating with the bird, and it also might be affected quite a bit by the light. So we've been mentioning, or I've been mentioning as a side point throughout this, various habitats. And these are major macro habitats, whether the woods are a decent tract size so that the birds, particularly the ones that breed and walk on the ground, can feel safe and be safe, whether they're deciduous or whether they're evergreen trees, whether they're trees that tend to grow north of Harpswell, more in Canada or northern Maine, whether they're open areas. And of course, ever since Mitchell Field has been developed, but yet saved, the center part of it, and also the center part of Curtis Farm, you have tree swallows, or you have bobolinks and other birds that require a more open area. We'll take a quick look at a couple of saltwater birds, and freshwater, of course, is one reason that Otto Pond is so, Otto Brook, excuse me, it's so key because it has fresh water, which there is not as plentiful as the salt water in Harpswell. And we don't have any deserts, but we have to at least be aware that that other area that I'm going to mention that is between here and Bath, it's not a desert, but it is scrubbier and it's more of a blueberry barren kind of habitat. And that's why it does present some variety to the preserves. So I've already mentioned this, I don't want to belabor it. And in case some of you might be wondering why the bird at the top is called an ovenbird, it's called an ovenbird because the nest that it builds on the ground is shaped kind of like an open oven. So the shape of the nest for the eggs is, it's not open to the sky the way a lot of birds are. It's on its side and open like an open old-fashioned oven. And then we have the hermit thrush at the bottom. And both of these birds spend most of their time on the floor of the forest, so to speak. And they're looking for evergreens and also both deciduous and evergreen, mixed woods, where you have a developed coverage for protection and also for food. All right, moving along, this is a warbler. This is a chestnut-sided warbler, and this one is fairly common. And I mention it because it tends to be much pretty low in the trees, or it likes a scrubby area. There was one nest that I would see pretty regularly at Curtis Farm, and there was another one that I would see pretty regularly at Schofield Shores Preserve. They do not want as deep of the woods as, say, the ovenbird. They want a more scrubbier kind of area. And they're very, needless to say, a very beautiful warbler. So I think particularly if you go on a guided tour or guided walk with a more experienced birder, you have a pretty decent chance of seeing a chestnut-sided warbler. They're kind of in the middle in terms of difficulty of seeing, I think. I certainly don't see them every time I'm out, but at the same time, they're not the hardest warbler to find. This one is a much more common warbler, and that's one reason why I'm showing it to you. This is common yellowthroat. It likes a kind of a more moist, a wetter kind of area. It tends to be very loud. It's one of the birds I would recommend that you listen to and try to be, somewhat aware of what a common common yellowthroat warbler sounds like, because you pretty much are guaranteed you're going to both see it and hear it. You'll probably hear it before you see it, but they're not that hard to see. There are quite a few of them. They usually will, instead of hiding, they oftentimes are a little aggressive in a way. I mean, they'll come to the end and just chatter, and so you have a fairly decent chance of seeing them. There was one, I remember last year walking down the beginning path of Otto Brook Preserve. It was on the left-hand side, and it just never shut up. So I don't guarantee it's still there. I didn't tether it to a limb, but again, if you can, on one of the apps I suggest, or one of the websites I'll suggest, listen to a common yellowthroat and see if you can become a little familiar with it. This is the most common warbler in Maine, I've been told, and I kind of believe that because there are a lot of them, and it also is a warbler that breeds in Maine. It is the black-throated green, which leads me to another little quirk about naming birds. I wouldn't say the green is the first thing you see when you look at this, but there is actually a green tint, you might say, on the top of its head and its back. And of course, the black throat is much more vivid. Notice again, it is a bird with wing bars. It has two wing bars. It has some barring along the side of his chest. It breeds in all of the woods in Harpswell. Its challenge, however, is, as you notice, it is sitting on an evergreen. Here's another one. They're sitting in an evergreen. They tend to be fairly high. They like to stay fairly high, not necessarily at the very top of the tree, but a good halfway up, if not 2/3 up. That's not saying that they're always there and that they never come down, but I'm just giving you tendencies. If you're out walking, you'll probably hear this. This is another bird that has a very common, a very distinctive song. So the ovenbird and the common yellowthroat and the black-throated green, these are three that have distinctive and fairly easy to recognize songs. Now this bird is, I had to put it in because of course it's a beautiful Blackburnian warbler. And there are people who believe this is the most beautiful warbler of all. Certainly is a good candidate. And it also breeds in Harpswell and other nearby places. However, here's the challenge. It does like to nest very high up in the trees. And you would think that with such a beautiful orange coloring that it would be easy to spot. But if you're in a thickly, already bloomed tree, let's put it that way, that's covered with limbs and leaves, it's not so easy to see. And then the added challenge with the Blackburnian warbler is that it has a very soft and a very high pitch. So a lot of people can't hear it at all, even if you know it's there. So it is a challenge, but again, it's worth knowing that you're surrounded by this beautiful bird. This is one other, and this is the last songbird I'm just going to show you. And this one I'm showing you because this nests primarily north here in boreal northern Maine or Canada. This is a bay-breasted warbler. And I happen to think this is my own personal taste, but I think this is the most beautiful warbler. It's a candidate, it's a competition, different styles between the Blackburnian and the bay-breasted. But you notice the bay-breasted does have two wing bars. It has some very distinctive markings. It does not look like this in the fall. So this is one of those birds that changes plumage in the fall, which makes it very challenging during fall migration. But it also represents one reason why May is such an incredible month for birding, is that not only do you see the species in their most vivid plumage because the males are trying to attract the females with their beautiful plumage and songs, but you also have an opportunity to see birds that are migrating north of here that you don't get to see very much other than during migration period. So May is the time to get out there and see what you can see. I actually am not sure why I have the bobolink here. I think I meant to have it a little earlier to represent the bird that is nesting in the open areas rather than in the woods. And some of you might have heard about the effort to actually pay farmers who are growing hay to not cut the hay quite so early in the season, to give bobolinks more of a chance for their nestlings to actually fledge. And so there are different organizations, conservation organizations, that work with farmers, and they pay the farmer some money so that the farmer will wait later into the season and not cut the first harvest of the hay, which gives the bobolinks more time, because otherwise, obviously, if the harvest is cut too soon, then and the nestlings and then in the nests, which are on the ground, are cut, then obviously you don't have a successful nesting season. We don't want to not pay any attention to the wonderful birds that are in the ocean, particularly in Harpswell, which has more ocean coastline than any other town in Maine. And the other reason for looking at this is a yellow leg. There are two species, greater yellow leg and lesser yellow leg. They look pretty similar, and for our purposes, we'll just say this is a yellow leg, and they're a shorebird. But the other reason for showing you this is that it points out something which I didn't know until I started birding, and that is all shorebirds, they do not migrate on the same schedule as songbirds. So shorebirds will migrate earlier, and then both in the spring, and then they also will leave their northern breeding areas earlier in the late summer and early fall, which is actually great as a birder, because when the songbirds are finished breeding in June, and it's harder to actually find them in August because they're pretty quiet. They're not singing, trying to attract their mates anymore. Yeah, you can go out and obviously see them, but you also have the added attraction and enjoyment of watching shorebird migration begin. So August, which is kind of a quiet time for songbirds, can be a great time to begin looking for the shorebirds. And I mean, I always see in August, and also in spring, early spring, I'll see yellow legs, for instance, at Beals Cove on Orr's Island, on Houghton Graves Park, which is a little park there. It's got a picnic table, and it's a great little spot right past the Orr's Island Library. I also see them, not surprisingly, at Curtis Farm, down at the Cove, and any number of places where you have shoreline. Another shorebird to keep an eye on during, again, particularly when things have gotten a little slower with the songbirds, are plovers. And I always go to Potts Point Preserve, and I will see semi-palmated plovers, which is what these are. They always are in groups, and they're very easy to spot. So don't forget about birding when the songbirds get a little harder to find. One other characteristic that you can both enjoy and also use to identify birds is behavior. And these are cedar waxwings, and many of you probably know that if you see one, you often see many more than one. They tend to flock together. This is just another picture of them flocking together. And they also will hang around later, much later in the fall than many of the other birds, because they will eat dried fruit and nuts and they're not as dependent on insects. So they will often be around, maybe apple trees and wherever there's some dried fruit. Beautiful, beautiful birds. And again, not surprisingly, I've seen them many times at Curtis Farm, but they're all over. And they're pretty easy to see because they're a bigger bird and they do tend to group. So look for them. All right, I'm just showing you one map, which is called a range map. We've been up to this point, we've been talking about habitat more in terms of locally, like is it is it woods, is it a shoreline, is it a meadow? But then you also have geography in a much broader scale. And one of the things that these maps can be very helpful is if you're looking at a bird and trying to identify it, as I did as a beginning birder, and I would feel, oh boy, I think I know what this is. And I would open up my field guide and discover that the bird I thought it was only exists in Southern California. So that can kind of be a blow to one's self-esteem, but actually it's interesting to see which birds are not at all in the Northeast and which ones are quite plentiful in the Northeast. Not surprisingly, some birds that didn't used to be as far north as Maine are now due to climate warming. And there used to be, for instance, no titmice, and now there are titmice, and I can mention others, but that would take us down another path. Some of you probably are particularly interested in hummingbirds, and the ruby-throated hummingbird is the only hummingbird that breeds east of the Mississippi. So that's one reason why people who really are into hummingbirds, they almost always eventually end up doing a little bit of traveling to either Arizona or Southern Arizona or Texas or California, in someplace Southwest, because that's where you can see a much greater number of hummingbirds than you can in New England. So this is the end of this section of my presentation. So this is a quick review. We talked about just using your eyes and just being a little bit more aware of what to look for with your eyes as you're looking at the bird. Just is it plump? Is it skinny? Is it smaller than a robin? Is it bigger than a robin? Does it have a narrow pointed beak that's likely to be looking for insects, or a much heavier, broader beak? Is the eye a dark eye, or is it a bright eye? Does it look even brighter because it has a white circle around it? Does it have wing bars? Is it solitary, or is it with groups? Does it hop or run fast? And last and I guess least is color. And so that added on to additional information that you learn as you read more about this, the habitat and the season of the year and the broad geography. All those things together will give you an idea of where to go to see certain kinds of birds, and vice versa. If you're in a particular place, what birds you're likely to see. I mean, one thing that I found really a fun aspect once I got interested in birding was that no matter where you are, you actually can bird. I mean, I used to think before I started birding that you had to go to beautiful preserves, and it is great that Harpswell has so many wonderful places to go. But the fact is, because the bird is looking for food, it's not necessarily looking for a beautiful picture. You can be, there's actually one really popular spot I know of, not around here, that's just a big manure pile. Now, you wouldn't necessarily say, hey, gee, let's go look at a manure pile today. But the point being is, if you're on a trip somewhere, it doesn't matter where you are, there will be places where you will find some birds. Okay, we're gonna go up and take a brief look at the one piece of equipment which you do need. And I'll go back to this. I'm not pushing any of these brands in particular. All I'm saying here is that there are a number of very good brands. What I will say, though, is that it's really important that you actually hold your binoculars that you're thinking of buying, if you don't already have a pair, in your hand. I know it's really tempting to get on the internet and hire and buy it that way, especially after this last year where you couldn't really go into stores safely anyway. But it's really important to hold binoculars in your hands. And I'll mention a little more on that later. I am also saying, though, that unless you already have a very expensive pair of binoculars, I do not recommend that you go after one of the top of the lines. Anything between 100 and 600, will be fine. There are certain basic characteristics, such as being waterproof, that if you're in a reputable store, particularly a reputable birding store or a camera store, some of the better camera stores also carry binoculars, or sporting goods store like LL Bean, they all will have products that are worth looking at. The key is, though, is what kind of magnification is appropriate for birding. Now, you might think that the bigger the magnification, the better. That actually isn't true. Every once in a while, you'll see some ad, buy these binoculars for $50 and they'll magnify your whatever you're looking at like 80 times. And you think, gee, that sounds great. Well, actually, it's not, for any number of reasons. And one of the reasons is that the larger the objective lens, which is the lens that is toward the object you're looking at, toward the bird, the larger that is, the heavier the binoculars are. And you're going to be walking and carrying these binoculars for hours. And weight really does make a difference. There's also a trade-off between the magnification and the light that's left, the light that is left in, and also the field of view. That is, how much do you actually see when you're looking through your binoculars? If you have a magnification, say, of 10, magnifying 10, and you have an objective lens of, say, 32 or even 42, the bigger that is, the bigger the magnification is in relation to the objective lens, will narrow down the field of view. Not going to get into the scientific aspect of it. So let me just summarize and say that if you have a chance, if you have friends who have decent binoculars, maybe you could ask them if you could borrow it one day just to get a feeling for that particular brand or that particular magnification. If you don't have anybody that you can borrow, then again, as I said, do go to a reputable store. There's a birding store in Freeport that is the Freeport, I don't know the exact name, but basically it's the Freeport Bird Supply store, and it's run and owned by a very avid birder and his wife. They both are. In fact, one of the books I'll recommend they wrote. So you can go there and you can look at different size binoculars, and as I said, you can go to LL Bean or what have you, but do consider the weight. And the reason I say shorebirds or songbirds at the bottom is that gives you some idea also as to whether how much you might be carrying it. If you're going to be maybe sitting, if you're lucky enough, for instance, to have water view from where you are, and you're using it mainly to look out at your local cove, then weight isn't as important as if you're walking for, 4 miles on a trail. So these are all factors. I have 2 pairs of binoculars. I have an 8 by 42 and a 10 by 42. It's a personal preference, but it is, another reason it's important to hold it in your hand is that they do feel different. There are some that feel better on smaller hands, there are others that feel better on larger hands. It's a real personal thing. You're going to be carrying it for a long time. So do try to give it some time before you buy anything. All right. Moving along to some basic resources so that you can go ahead with your own interest at your own speed after this is over. We're going to look at some basic field guides. We'll look at some apps, and we'll look at some websites. The specialized bird families, I just threw that in there because as you get interested, you'll then start looking for books that have to do with a particular type of bird, but mainly we'll look at field guides, apps, and websites. The top 3 books that I'm showing you now tell you where in Maine are some great places to go birding. The one on the left, A Birder's Guide to Maine, it's really pretty old. I actually probably should take that off of this slide, but I left it on because at one time I left it on because I knew that it had been made into an ebook, and so I left it on for people who use Kindle or other formats for ebooks. But I've just recently done some research and have discovered that the 2 books on the right, the Maine Birding Trail and the Bird Watching in Maine Trail, those also have been made into ebooks now. So that kind of takes away the main reason I had kept that older Birder's Guide. But still, it's a very good book, and you might run into it, who knows, at the Orr's Island Library book sale or some used bookstore or something. And if you do, it's certainly worth a quick purchase. But the 2 on the right are the 2 that are really much more current, and I recommend. And they also are written by avid birders and guides that are still active. The one in the middle is written by Bob Duché, who lives in the Bangor area, and he does a lot of guiding, mainly in the boreal areas of northern Maine and also shore ocean birding. He's very good. He's also quite accomplished in many different areas. He has a radio show. He also has a pretty good number of videos on YouTube. So if you go into YouTube and you look up Bob Duché, and his name will be on this handout that Julie is going to hand out. So don't worry if you don't have all these names jotted down. But he's put together some really nice, and not super long, but really nice birding videos on YouTube that specialize in Maine birding. And he was one of the creators of the Maine Birding Trail, which is a website which we'll look at shortly. He also was a state representative in the legislature, the Maine legislature. He calls himself now a recovering representative, so make of that as you wish. The other book, the Bird Watching in Maine, is by Derek Levitch, and he is the person I just mentioned who co-owns the Freeport Bird Supply Store and also leads trips. So one of those 2 books is really worth having, full of even if you don't bird, just places you might not know of that are just great to explore. Now, the three books at the bottom are three basic field guides, and field guides are also somewhat personal in taste. Some are illustrations like the Sibley Bird Guide. Some are pictures like the National Geographic. People have their own preferences and there's pros and cons. But any of these three are certainly worthwhile. All of them have been out long enough that you have a decent chance of maybe getting a used one. The Peterson Guide used to be the be all and the end all before Sibley took over. And Peterson's claim to fame, one of them, was that he used arrows to point at identifiers on the bird. So he would actually mark the field guide, the species, and say, look, on this particular species, the field guide that's most helpful for identification is the eye ring or the wing bar or the barring on the breast, whatever it happened to be. But Sibley's pretty much taken over the role that the Peterson field guide has taken, but it's still a personal taste. I happened, the first couple of years I was birding, to be honest, I happen to prefer, and so do many other people, because it's in the 7th edition or something like that, the National Geographic Bird Guide. It just had a level of information which I felt more comfortable or more ready to absorb. Although now I do use the Sibley Guide more, but that's personal. This I'll just throw up quickly. As I mentioned, if you get into this, you might get particularly interested in songbirds or particularly interested in raptors, birds of prey. There's any number of books. I mean, I just put this up to point out the fact that you might find yourself being drawn to a particular family of birds and therefore want to get a book that specializes in that family. And then the picture on the right-hand side, the bird watching. This is a bi-monthly magazine. Every other month it comes out. There's 6 a year. And I put it up here because it's one of the few birding magazines that I think it has a target that reaches a lot of just regular birders. It's not geared toward the professional scientist. It's not geared, on the other hand, to somebody who only wants to know, like what is on their feeder. It's geared more to somebody who's interested in learning more about birds, but they're not an ornithologist. They're not a professional scientist. So it usually has an article or two about identification. It has some great photographs. Actually, it's increased the number of photographs because more and more people have gotten into photography. Sibley usually has a brief column on identifying. So, and I just mention it, I'm not pushing it, but it is one of the few magazines that touches, well, birders like me. So that's why I mention it, I guess. All right, we're going to move on now to looking at websites. And I suspect that this is where you're going to get most of your ongoing information. There are endless numbers of really wonderful and informative websites. However, almost everybody starts with the Cornell Lab or one of the sites that they sponsor, Cornell Lab of Ornithology. If you go on to, say, Google search or whatever search engine that you use, and you put in the name of the species, almost inevitably the first target that will be listed will be www.allaboutbirds.org. I would guarantee 9 times 10, that's the first website that's going to pop up if you're just asking for an identification. The other website, though, which goes into much more than identification, well, of course, so does All About Birds, but both, as you can see, you've got live cams, you have courses, but most people start using this with just quick identification. But soon after that, you're also going to go into eBird, and you're not going to find a birder that I don't think that isn't familiar by now with eBird. You can have an entire, in fact, there are entire courses on eBird. So my main purpose here is just to familiarize yourself with the fact that eBird does exist. It also is sponsored, put together, and financed by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. It's started off as a database where people could enter the species that they have found, and it would over time create a database that could be used for all kinds of scientific research. It has grown much, much, much beyond that. And there is a very simple and clear introductory course that you can just take right from eBird and find out how to use it. It can be used in many, many different ways. And so all I'm going to do here is show you a couple ways that you can use it to help you know what you're likely to see if you go out birding, and also what times of year certain birds are likely to occur and where. So we start off again, you can use it for identification, but it'll continue in a much deeper level than the All About Birds one did. In addition to entering the name of the species, which you can do on the left side of this particular slide, you also can use it to see what is being seen in a particular geographic location. And I chose this one because if you look in the lower right-hand area of this screen, you will see that there's an option called bar charts. And a bar chart will visually show you what birds are being seen at a particular time of year. And that's, I chose that to show you one way that you can use eBird to help you in Harpswell. I went into the eBird option hotspot and I just typed in Harpswell, and up popped a number of the land trust preserves that you all are familiar with. You could also, in that hotspot, instead of putting in Harpswell, you could also just put in more specifically the Cliff Trail or Tundy's Harbor or the Long Reach Preserve, whatever you think you are interested in finding out what has been seen in the past or what is being seen right now. This is a bar chart, and we're certainly not going to look at it in too much detail, but just to show you how you can use it yourself. What I did was I put in the Curtis Farm Preserve, and I said, I added that arrow at the top, and I said, what has been seen there in May, because this is May, over the last 20 years. And this and there, the pages that popped up are many, many more than what you're seeing here, but this shows you how you can use it. So you just glance down very quickly. You can see that, for instance, the Canada geese were seen. However, a wood duck was not seen. The second line is a wood duck, and there's nothing there. So that's not absolutely saying that it's impossible to see a wood duck there, but it sure is unlikely. And so if your main purpose was to go out and see a wood duck, which is a beautiful, beautiful duck, you probably would not go to Curtis Farm. Another way you can use these kind of graphs is the other direction. And that is, let's say you want to see a blue-headed vireo, which I have an arrow there on the left-hand side. So you really are out to see, you've just decided, I want to see a blue-headed vireo. Well, so you're trying to decide which preserve should give, which land trust gives me the best chance of seeing a blue-headed vireo. Well, let's take a look. Here's Otter Brook Preserve. And it tells me that I have a pretty good chance of seeing a blue-headed vireo there. Look at all the green bars that appear in May. So that probably, I don't have the exact dates for those, but at least it tells you that there's a decent chance of seeing a blue-headed vireo there. And this is a blue-headed vireo, beautiful vireo. And again, there you see the wing bars, you see the popping white ringed eye, the clear breast with a little bit of yellow. It's a very nice vireo. All right, I mentioned this, alluded to this earlier. So this is the one property that is not in Harpswell that I recommend you check out for a couple different reasons. This is the Captain William Fitzgerald Recreation and Conservation Area in Brunswick. When the naval base closed, this was handed off to Brunswick. They've done a pretty nice job keeping it at the type of habitat that is fairly rare in Maine. It's a scrubby, low tree, dry habitat. They actually do controlled fires there to keep it from overgrowing too much. And it's a blueberry barren, basically. And so there are birds there that you can see them on Harpswell, but you're much more likely to see them if you go there. It's off the Old Bath Road. You can certainly look it up and see exactly how to get there off the Old Bath Road. And this is one of the birds. This is a warbler, a prairie warbler that loves this kind of habitat. And it's a beautiful bird. And if you want to see a breeding prairie warbler, this is a place to go. That field sparrow that I mentioned earlier, that you saw earlier, that we compared with the song sparrow, that also breeds here. And so you will see a field sparrow there. You'll also see some other birds I haven't mentioned, like towhees, which is a bird that is big and sings a lot. So you have a good chance of seeing some other really nice and interesting birds if you go there. And then the final little extra bonus is if you go there in August during blueberry season, you can pick some wonderful wild blueberries. So you've got everything going for you. Although I wouldn't wait for August to see the breeding songbirds. I would go right now, or maybe in 2 weeks, okay, the end of May, and go for a nice walk. It does get very hot there though, because you don't have a lot of trees. You have trees, but they're scrubby and they're low. So don't go on a really hot day, you'll die. And I don't want to be responsible for you dying, but do go and check it out. All right, this is one other, this is a kind of a neat website. I'll just show you one slide from it. It only really functions in May. I grabbed this screen May 2nd. This site is uses radar to predict how many birds are likely to be migrating through your area that night or the next night. I just looked at it and it was looking like this coming weekend is looking next, well, I guess we're not on the weekend yet, are we? But you can see very clearly, this is called cast.info. It's not cast, it's not .org, it's .info. But I have it on the handout, so don't worry about it. And so if you look at it, it'll give you an idea of, but it's not any kind of a guarantee. It's just to give you some idea of what the odds are that there are a lot of new birds coming in the next day or not. All right. I mentioned Maine Birding Trail before. This is a website that's put together with the express purpose of helping you find places to go in Maine that are of interest, courses. It's just full of information. This was the one that I mentioned that Bob Deshay was involved in. Obviously, I can't show you everything on this website. Please look at it yourself. You can tell just from looking at these headings that it's just chock full of information, and you can get a free printed guide. I believe it's free. I won't guarantee that, but you can certainly get a lot of free information from it. So this is one of the references that will be on the handout. Obviously, Maine Audubon is worth your attention. Merrimeeting is the chapter that Harpswell is a member of. They lead walks and obviously sessions. They're participating. This is a red stork. It's also a warbler, and it's actually one of the easier ones to see, particularly in the fall. They're fairly plentiful and they fly around a lot, so that you're looking for movement. When you are looking for warblers, you're primarily at first, you're looking for movement. And so since this is a bird that does fly around a lot, you're more likely to see it. I should mention, and I should have, when we were talking about the binoculars, that and I hope you will get out in the field, and if you are a beginner, that there'll be a guide to help you. But one of the main first things to learn when you're looking for songbirds is you don't look with the binoculars at first. You just look with your eyes. You look for movement. And then after you see something move in the tree or wherever you see it, you keep your eyes focused on what you're looking at and bring the binoculars up to your eyes. So you're not finding the bird with the binoculars. You're finding the bird with your eyes. You're using the binoculars to then see the bird better. And it takes a little practice, but you'll get it. All right. Excuse me. This is, I added this one because I happen to know one of the people who, well, not personally, but I know him as a very accomplished birder and course creator. And they've just put out, and I haven't watched this yet, so I do throw this out with a grain of salt, but I do have trust in the creators of this. This is a free introductory course, so it's up to you if you want to check it out. It's interesting, they do have paid courses too, but this one is a free introductory course. It's interesting they call this spark birding, because there's a term and a question that comes up a lot of times, particularly among birders. They'll say, "Oh, what was your spark bird?" And all they're asking you is there a bird that sparked your interest, that kind of lit up your interest? And so it was a takeoff on that kind of an idea. A lot of birders do have a spark bird. Well, it's like, it doesn't have to be a rare bird. My spark bird happens to be a coot, which is a water bird, not rare at all, but for whatever reason, it sparked my interest in birding. And you might have a bird that just sparked your interest. All right. People now, they do have field guides, and I do highly have a field guide, but you're more likely to leave it in the car or leave it in your house than carrying it into the field the way people used to have to. Now we have apps. I'm not going to get into all these apps, but I will mention a couple that I do think you should start with. The Audubon map in the upper right-hand corner, app, excuse me, not map, app. The Audubon app is totally free, and it's really quite good. We're talking now just about North American birds. I forgot to mention that once when I presented this session, and I had someone come up to me, ran into me in the field and said, I had Audubon and it didn't help me at all in England. And so now I'm more careful about saying that the databases for these apps are North American birds, of which there are about 1,000. There are other, if you go abroad to another country, you can also increase that database or get different apps, but that's a different story. Merlin, not surprisingly put up by Cornell Lab of Ornithology, which I mentioned, is geared specifically to help beginners. And it will start off by asking you the shape and the size. Some of the questions that you used to have to manually put in now can be automatically deduced. For instance, the time of day. If you're on the smartphone, it's automatically have GPS on, so it'll tell the app where your geography is. It'll tell them what time of day it is. And so you don't have to put in as much information as you might have had to in the past. A lot of these apps keep adding features so that a lot of them overlap with features, and it becomes almost just a personal reference, a personal preference as to, whether you want Audubon or Sibley or what. I can't even tell you exactly what all the features are for all these. I suggest, though, that you definitely start off with the top two, and then you can look into the others. The only reason I'm hesitating a little bit on saying grab Sibley is I know that you have to pay for it. So I don't want to tell you anything that get that you have to pay for until you have a sense as to how much you're interested in it. iNaturalist, which is at the lower right-hand corner, is not just limited to birds. It's an app that helps you identify a number of different natural objects, flowers, trees, and so forth. But I put it there because it's very popular, and it does help you with things other than birds too. The others you're going to basically have to look into on your own, but they are the most common apps that people are using now. So this is pretty much the end of the crash course. I did add this because a little tongue-in-cheek, but it also is, I think, true. Be patient. Patient is a good idea when looking for a bird. Give a bird a second chance. Take a wait and see attitude, and you'll see why. If you don't keep waiting, be patient until your clothes go out of style. This doesn't apply to birding togs. They were never in style. God gave birders clothing so that golfers would have something to laugh at. The patience part of it is certainly true. But if you're enjoying what you're doing, then no problem, right? So with that, I will end this part of it, and we'll move on and see if we could answer a couple questions if I can.
Great, thank you so much, Judy. So I encourage you all, if you have any questions, to type them in the chat and I'll ask them. I'll ask Judy them. So feel free to type any questions you have in the chat for us. Or maybe you gave them all the information they need.
Or they're asleep. I'm not sure which.
That was a really helpful presentation, Judy. I really learned some things. I appreciate it. There is a question here. It says, for guides, if you have older editions, is that an issue, and should she buy newer editions of those field guides?
That's a good question. I know that in the case of Sibley, the second edition made some changes, improvements on the maps. But again, I don't think that's worth buying a new edition. I think it does vary depending on, which field guide you're talking about. In the case of National Geographic, I wouldn't get the first edition, but I think if it's within 5 years, you're okay. All right. I mean, most of the changes are going to be real precise and probably not what you're looking for anyway.
Okay, great. There is another question specifically about wood ducks. Where do wood ducks nest?
In fresh ponds, lakes. They are secretive, but they do come out. They tend to hide in whatever growth is around the edges of the lake. That's one of the species where the female looks quite different from the male. But I think the female is quite beautiful. But most people, when they think of that, they think of the male. I don't know where in Harpswell the wood ducks are. I don't know if somebody could offer that, if you know.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. Another question for you personally, what led you to birding?
Well, I love to explore. And so I would just go on walks. And the more I saw, the more I was interested in learning. But I think part of it too, and I hear from many people that it's common for people to get interested by just look, particularly after they retire. And this was around the same time I retired, where they put out feeders and they're looking at birds at their feeders. And then they think, well, gee, this is great, but I want to see a wider variety of birds. And there's only so many birds you can bring in to your feeder because you can't change your habitat that much. So I think it's just a lot of times it's a slow process.
Yeah. Great. Another question about ravens. Are ravens common in Harpswell? This person saw a gigantic blackbird on the cliff trail.
I would say yes. Yes, they are. And they are increasing, and for a kind of an interesting reason. There was a bit of a problem with the decrease in nesting, but ravens have found that telecommunication towers are great places to nest. And so actually they've adapted. And so they're doing well.
And then there's a question about bluebirds from someone who says, I try to get bluebirds in my boxes, but the tree swallows drive them out. Do you have any suggestions? I have one I've heard if you don't.
Why don't you take this one then, Julia?
What I've heard, and I'll say I'm not an expert, but what I've heard is that if you put two boxes fairly close to each other, say like, this is what we do at some of our land trust preserves, they're maybe 10 feet apart from each other. What I've heard is that the tree swallows won't nest near another tree swallow pair. So one of the boxes might be taken up by tree swallows, but no other tree swallow will nest in the second box. So that leaves it open for the bluebirds. And I think that's all the questions I have. There was some comments in the chat saying that it was a great talk and people really enjoyed it, but I think that's all the questions. And we are right at 8 o'clock, so that was pretty perfect timing. So
Yeah.
again, thanks for the talk and thanks to everyone for joining us. And I will be sending out an email with the resource sheet that Judy.
Thank you. I think that will help because I know I went fast. So, okay. Well, this was great. Good luck and happy birding.
Yes, I hope you all enjoy getting out and birding in this beautiful weather coming up.
Okay.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.